welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. In the last episode, we talked about the three types of oral communication in the ancient world. First was the informal and uncontrolled method, which is basically just the same type of normal talking to other people that we do today. Second was the informal and controlled method, and we went into detail about that last time. Remember the telling and retelling of stories to the same group of people in order to reinforce individual memory, but also to create a community memory? Well, today we're going to talk about the third type of oral communication, the formal and controlled method. This is where there was an exact series of words that would have to been delivered by one person and must be memorized by another person or a community. The more common way of referring to the formal and controlled method is to call it oral tradition. So what is oral tradition? When we're talking about oral tradition, we're talking about highly structured statements. These are meant to be memorized, and every single word was important. You could not simply remember the big parts and vary a few details like you could with the informal and controlled method. Every single bit had to be remembered perfectly. Oral tradition communicated a lot of very important teaching in a short space. Often, these would have to be unpacked because each word and phrase carried with it a lot of meaning. While oral tradition would not have to be created in a religious context, we're going to focus specifically on the ones in Christianity. The oral traditions we're going to be talking about represent the earliest official teachings in Christianity. Often we can't trace their origins, but if they represent official teaching, they probably come from official people, and we've got a fairly good idea of who they were. A little later in this episode, we'll look at one oral tradition that we can probably trace the origins of. One final note, we don't have these oral traditions simply passed down to us now still in oral form. They come down to us via the other works in the New Testament. In other words, they are quoted in various places in the New Testament. But we know for a fact that they are older than the works we find them in because they are quoted. Think about it. If you write an email to someone and make a reference to something else, maybe a scene in a movie or something someone said at work or school, then that thing is going to predate the email, right? You could not be talking about something that happened in the past unless it happened in the past. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that we're going to be talking about things that are recorded in the various works of the New Testament, but they actually were created previously. So, let's get into the first oral tradition we're going to talk about today. Jesus is Lord. The statement, Jesus is Lord, is one of the earliest oral traditions we are aware of. We find it in places like 1 Corinthians 12:3 and Romans 10:9. Now, this tradition does at least two things. First, it centers Christianity around Jesus. It does not simply say that any old person is Lord, it says that Jesus is Lord. If you're going to be a Christian, then you should understand that Christianity is centered around the person of Jesus. Second, it says something about who Jesus is. Lord is a title. It meant ruler, i.e., the one in charge. This had a very specific reference in early Christianity because Caesar was also referred to as Lord. Saying Jesus is Lord meant Caesar was not. This was a very specific claim about who was really in charge of the world. Early Christians were saying that Jesus is in charge and Caesar is not. This would get them into trouble later on when Christianity got big enough for Rome to notice that it existed. At this point, though, Rome didn't notice, and for a long time, Christianity was just considered to be a sect of Judaism anyway, but that's another story. So, as we said, this is one of the earliest oral traditions. It began to chart a course for early Christianity by making it clear what this fledgling religion was all about. A lot more would be said about Jesus later, but this formed one of the building blocks. And it was also very simple to remember. In English, it is just 3 words. In Greek, it is only 2. And yet it gives one of the most basic elements of theology. It takes the knowledge that people had heard about through word-of-mouth communication, which we talked about in the last episode, and gave shape to it. It said very simply and clearly what the early Christians thought of Jesus. Now that we've taken a look at a simple oral tradition, let's take a look at one that has a bit more substance to it. One of the most important oral traditions in the New Testament is found in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7. It says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. So let's break this thing down. First, verse 3 says, "For I delivered to you, as of first importance, what I also received." The Greek words here, remember, Greek is the language of the New Testament. The Greek words here for received and delivered are the words for the formal passing on of oral tradition. So when someone heard these words, they knew that someone was communicating official oral tradition. These words indicate that we're dealing with a formal and controlled method of communication. This tradition was to be memorized exactly, with 0 variances. Second, there is a 4-part structure to this tradition that most of us miss when we just read over it, but it is extremely important. I'm going to read verses 3 to 5 again and emphasize the word "that." "For I delivered to you, as of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. In Greek, these stick out even more. The author or authors of this hymn designed these to stick out on purpose. I think there are a number of really good English translations, and we'll talk more about them in the final episode of this series. But this is one thing that I think English translations get wrong. I think English translations would be more faithful to the meaning of the text if they would not translate things like this so smoothly. They do a great job of making this smooth, but it was not meant to be smooth. This was meant to be choppy. It was meant to be broken up. Because when we break these 4 parts up, this is what we find. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, Christ's death. That he was buried, Christ's burial. That he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, Christ's resurrection. That he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, etc. Christ's post-resurrection appearances. In order, you see Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and appearances to people after his death. This structure exists for a reason, and it is extremely important, which is why I think we should not simply glide smoothly over it. We should have to stop and pause. Now, this 4-part structure is the same basic structure that we see in all 4 Gospels. When you read them, they all tell the same story of the end of Jesus' life with the same basic pattern: death, burial, resurrection, and appearances. Yes, I know Mark doesn't record the appearances, but still the same order. Mark just cut things off a bit early. And there's a good reason for that, but we're not going to get into that now. Anyway, what is so interesting about this is that this tradition is not based on the Gospels, rather the Gospels are based on this tradition. This is what is so important about these early oral traditions. These traditions are the foundations of everything else that we find in Christianity. Something else you should know is that this tradition predates the Gospels by a lot. Let me show you how. Now, before I get going on this, I'm going to tell you that this next bit is a bit involved and kind of detailed. I'm going to go through some of the basics in the chronology of Paul's life. I will make the main point at the end, which will be important, but everything up to that point is me trying to show you a little bit of how scholars arrive at some of these dates. If this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. It's not going to affect the rest of this episode. And if you want to mentally check out for the next couple of minutes, that's totally fine. I will tell you when to check back in. So, you ready? Here we go. Somewhere around 52 to 54, 1 Corinthians was written. This is the letter we find this oral tradition in, so it's at least that old. But remember, Paul is quoting to them something that he had already given them. Remember, he said, "For I delivered to you," past tense, "what I also received." So when was Paul in Corinth? Well, we know with a strong degree of certainty that in AD 51, Paul stood before the proconsul Gallio. Proconsuls of senatorial rank serve 1-year terms, so it's really easy to pinpoint when Gallio was in Corinth. And if we assume Paul's trial was near the end of his time in Corinth and near the beginning of Gallio's time in office, then we get Paul's trial in AD 51, possibly in the summer, maybe in August. That means that Paul arrived in Corinth in the winter of the end of AD 49, beginning of AD 50, and stayed for about 18 months. Sometime during this time, Paul delivered the oral tradition to the Corinthians. But when did Paul receive the tradition? You can't give something to someone that you don't have. Fortunately, Paul helps us with that. He gives us an idea of when he got this tradition and other traditions. Now, maybe a year or so before Paul was in Corinth, he was at the Jerusalem Council that you see in Acts 15. And Paul also talks about this council in one of his letters. In Galatians 1-2, Paul gives us a timeline of what happened after his conversion, and we find the Jerusalem Council in Galatians 2, though it's not mentioned by name. In this timeline, Paul talks about a period of 3 years and a period of 14 years. But the way they counted time back then was inclusive, so if you're talking about a period of 2 years and 1 day, they would say 3 years. I know it sounds weird, but that's what they did. So these time periods could actually be 2 years and 13 years as we would figure them. It's probably best, therefore, to figure 15 to 16 years total from the time that Paul converted until the Jerusalem Council. That would put Paul's conversion probably around AD 33, give or take, assuming Jesus was crucified in AD 30. Though it is possible that Jesus was crucified in AD 33, in which case his timeline would just get squished a bit. All of that means that Paul meets with Peter and James and receives tradition in probably AD 35 to 36. But again, that's when Paul received the tradition. It still had to be composed before that because Paul didn't write it. When it was composed, however, has to be estimated. But here are what a couple scholars think about when it was composed. Attention, everyone. If you mentally checked out during the chronology stuff, it's time to come back. We are now resuming our regularly scheduled programming. Now, here are a couple of quotes I want to share with you about when this tradition was written. The first is by Bart Ehrman. Some of you might know who Bart is. If you don't, you should know he describes himself as an agnostic with atheistic leanings, and he spends much of his time trying to undo traditional Christianity. Concerning the verses we are talking about now in 1 Corinthians 15, he says the following. The traditions he, Paul, inherited must date to just a couple years or so after Jesus' death. So someone unfriendly to traditional Christianity acknowledges how early the traditions were written, within a couple years after Jesus' death. The second quote I want to give you is from James Dunn, who is a New Testament scholar and expert on Paul. He says the following. This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated within months of Jesus' death. So what we're looking at is an oral tradition that was composed within a few months to a few years after the death of Jesus. But it gets better. When we go back to Paul's record of events in Galatians 1-2, we see where he got his information from. In Galatians 1:18, it says that Paul visited Cephas, or Peter. It's the same name. Cephas means stone in Aramaic, Peter means stone in Greek. And along with Peter, Paul also saw James, Jesus' brother. The Greek word for visit is hysteresis, which is where we get our modern English word, history. It doesn't mean merely to visit. It means to visit for the purpose of coming to know someone or something. Paul wanted to get to know Peter and to get information from him. Paul wasn't there just to hang out. He was there to check that he was teaching the right things. As I said, he met with Peter and James. These were the leaders of the early church, and if there were oral tradition that had been created, you can bet they would have given it to Paul. Now, here's where things get interesting. Let me read verses 5-7 of the Creed again, the part that talks about the appearances. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. If you notice, there are two people mentioned by name, Cephas, Peter, and James. The early oral tradition says that these two people saw Jesus risen from the dead. Who are the two people that Paul met with on his trip to Jerusalem? Cephas, Peter, and James. If these two men gave Paul the tradition, and the tradition lists them as people that Jesus appeared to after his death, then what we have is eyewitness testimony. Understand? Peter and James gave Paul official oral tradition that includes them as witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. That's them saying, we saw Jesus rise from the dead. And if you remember what we talked about just a little while ago, this tradition was composed within a few months to a few years after Jesus' death. This completely undercuts the claim that information about Jesus was written so late that we can't know anything. We have eyewitness testimony from a few months to a few years after Jesus' death saying, we saw Jesus risen from the dead. This also answers the question that some people bring up, how can we know anything about what happened to Jesus? It was 2,000 years ago. It doesn't matter how long ago an event was. What matters is how close to the event our information comes from. And in this case, we have eyewitness testimony from within a few months to a few years after the death of Jesus saying, we saw him risen from the dead. Now, I understand that I've been going on for a long time about the history behind this creed in 1 Corinthians 15. If I wanted to merely share a little bit about this creed, I certainly could have done it in a lot less time. However, I wanted to make the claim that we had eyewitness testimony to Jesus' resurrection within a few months to a few years after it happened. And given that this occurred 2,000 years ago, this is no small claim. So, before I made it, I wanted to show you how I was able to make such a claim on historical grounds. I hope you found it interesting. I'm sorry it was so lengthy. I will try to be briefer in the future. As a side note, this whole issue of eyewitnesses brings up the question, how can we know whether Jesus actually rose from the dead or not from a historical perspective? This is something we will get into at a later date. I will do a whole series on that question. For now, though, I want to return to oral tradition. We've spent a long time on 1 Corinthians 15. Briefly, though, I would like to look at two other examples of traditions that we find in the New Testament, but we won't go into anywhere near as much depth as we did with 1 Corinthians. First up is Philippians 2, 6 through 11, which says, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This creed has been studied quite a lot because it speaks of the incarnation. It talks about Jesus being in the form of God and then taking the form of a servant, i.e., a human. Of course, there are a lot of questions surrounding this particular creed because it says that when Jesus became human, he emptied himself. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that Jesus stopped being divine? Orthodox Christianity says no. So what does it mean then? Here we have to ask the questions, what does it mean to be God? What does it mean to be man? And how can those two be combined, if at all, as early Christians said? Whatever the answers are, this is a formalized oral tradition that Paul is quoting in his letter to the Philippians, and it represents something both earlier and something official. Second, and lastly, I want to point you towards the household codes. These were formalized rules that were meant to inform Christians how one should behave in the family. I want to read you the one in Colossians 3:18 through 4:1, but you should also check out the one in Ephesians 5:22 through 6:9. Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people-pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Obviously, there are a lot of things in this that sound quite harsh to modern ears. Wives obey your husbands and slaves obey your masters are what really stick out. In the ancient world, though, those particular parts would have been considered high morals, which followed the thought of Aristotle. What it means for people today and whether or not any of this still applies is a much bigger issue that I will address, but not here. I did my doctoral dissertation on Colossians, and I'm slowly teaching my way through the letter. I promise to go in-depth on this particular code and its issues when we get to that part of the letter. For now, I just want to say that everything is not as it seems. Related to that, there is another oral tradition in Colossians, the Christological hymn in chapter 1. For those who have just started listening to this podcast, I'm currently teaching through the letter to the Colossians, and the hymn is next up. I will be going through it in great depth, because it basically gives us the core of Christian theology. So, stay tuned, that's coming in a few months. Anyway, I want to conclude here for today. We took a decent look at two of the early oral traditions that are recorded in the New Testament, and took a passing look at two others. Really, what I wanted to do was not so much tell you everything that we can learn from them, but show you that they exist and give them their appropriate place in the creation of the New Testament. These traditions would have been created and or recognized by early church leaders like Peter and James, and they represented official Christian teaching from the very beginning of Christianity. In the last episode, we saw that good information about Jesus could easily have continued for quite a while after the events themselves happened. However, right from the beginning, those who were closest to Jesus put together concise theological statements about what they believed was most important in knowing what Christianity was all about. These early oral traditions represent the foundation of the theology for Christianity, and everything that we see later on, the letters of people like Paul, the canonical Gospels, and so forth, will be expected to conform to the standard that these oral traditions set. In the next episode, we're going to start looking at the various letters that we see in the New Testament, since most of these predate the Gospels. I hope this and the previous episode have given you an idea of how information was communicated before things started getting written down in early Christianity, and I look forward to talking with you next week.